The Navigator died at her post with blood streaming from her empty sockets and a smile frozen across her lips. I found her slumped against the observation throne 3 hours into my watch cycle, the crystalline dome of the oculus still humming with residual psychic resonance. Her third eye had ruptured completely, weeping a colorless fluid that pooled in the geometric patterns etched into the deck plating. The crew whispered that she had seen something beautiful in those final moments, something that burned through her mind like phosphex through flesh. I did not believe them. I had served aboard the Tertius Vigil long enough to know that navigators never smiled when they died. They screamed. They clawed at their own skulls. They begged for the Emperor's mercy as the sea of souls tore through the membrane between thought and reality. But Navigator Kaelia died smiling, and that terrified me more than any warp predator ever could. The silence came without warning. One moment, the Geller field generators thrummed with their usual desperate frequency, straining against the tide of unreality pressing against the ship's hull. The next moment, nothing. The omnipresent psychic pressure that every voidsman learns to ignore, the way you ignore the recycled air in your lungs or the distant rumble of the plasma drives, simply vanished. The absence felt like a physical thing, a void where something fundamental should have existed. I stood in the navigation chamber with Kaelia's corpse cooling beside me and felt the universe hold its breath. The emergency klaxons should have been screaming. The ship's Astropath should have been shrieking warnings through the Vox network. Instead, we drifted through the Imperium in perfect, crystalline silence, and I understood with absolute certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the fabric of reality itself. My name is Castor Vrain. I served as fourth officer aboard the Tertius Vigil, a dictator-class cruiser in the service of Battlefleet Obscurus. We had been transiting from the Cadian Gate toward the Scaris sector when the silence fell. Our holds carried 3,000 tons of prefabricated fortifications, ammunition for a dozen guard regiments, and 6 companies of Cadian shock troops fresh from the Casley training grounds. We were one ship among thousands ferrying men and material across the segmentum, a single drop of blood in the Imperium's vast circulatory system. When the warp fell silent, we became something else entirely. We became witnesses to an impossible moment, a caesura in the eternal war between order and chaos. What we witnessed in those 24 hours changed everything I believed about duty, about faith, about the nature of the universe we inhabited. Some truths should remain buried in the dark between stars. This is not one of them. The ship's master, Captain Helvor Christ, summoned the senior staff to the Strategium exactly 17 minutes after Navigator Kaelia's death. I remember the exact time because I checked my chronometer 3 times during the walk from the navigation chamber, certain that the device had malfunctioned. Time itself felt wrong in the silence, stretched thin like promethium across water. The corridors of the Tertius Vigil echoed with a different quality of sound, as if the ship had suddenly grown larger, or the void outside had grown emptier. Crew members stood in small clusters at intersection points, speaking in urgent whispers that died whenever an officer approached. They knew something had changed. The human body understands when the fundamental laws of nature shift, even if the conscious mind refuses to accept it. I passed 3 separate groups of ratings, making the sign of the Aquila and murmuring prayers to the God Emperor. One woman, a gun deck loader whose name I never learned, grabbed my arm as I passed and asked me if we were dead. I told her no. I do not know if I believed it. The Strategium occupied the heart of the command deck, a vaulted chamber lined with data displays and tactical projectors. Captain Christ stood before the primary hololithic table when I entered, his weathered face illuminated by the ghostly green light of ship schematics and stellar cartography. He had served the Imperial Navy for 47 years, commanding 3 different vessels before taking the Tertius Vigil. I had never seen him uncertain. In 4 years of service, I had watched him navigate warp storms, coordinate fleet actions against Orc corsairs, and maintain iron discipline through 6-month patrol routes where crew members went mad from the isolation. He stood before that table, and his hands shook. The sight struck me like a physical blow. First Lieutenant Harrow stood to his right, her augmetic eye cycling through visual spectrums as if trying to perceive something beyond normal vision. Chief Engineer Delthor occupied his usual position near the environmental controls, mechadendrites twitching with agitation as they interfaced with ship systems. Astropath-sanctioned Meridius sat in his suspension cradle near the communications station, his withered body wrapped in ceremonial robes that reeked of incense and old suffering. "The Geller field is stable," Christ said without preamble. His voice carried the flat tone of a man reciting facts he did not believe. "Plasma drives are functioning at 97% efficiency. Life support is nominal. Hull integrity is perfect. According to every measurement we possess, the Tertius Vigil is performing exactly as designed." He paused and looked at each of us in turn. "And yet Navigator Kaelia is dead with no signs of demonic intrusion. The Astropath has received no messages or psychic disturbances for the past 21 minutes. The warp itself has gone silent." He spread his hands across the hololithic table as if bracing himself against a physical weight. "Someone explain this to me in terms that do not violate every principle of naval doctrine I have spent my life studying." Astropath Meridius spoke first, his voice a dry whisper that crawled across the strategium like insects across skin. "I can feel nothing beyond the hull, my lord. The Sea of Souls has not disappeared. It still exists beneath us, around us, sustaining the ship's transit through impossible space. But it has become calm, perfectly calm. The currents that tear at the boundaries between thought and matter have ceased their motion. The entities that inhabit the Imperium have withdrawn or fallen silent." His eyeless face turned toward the captain with eerie precision. "In 2 centuries of service to the Astronomican and the Golden Throne, I have never experienced such silence. It is as if the warp itself has died and we are adrift in its corpse." "Impossible," First Lieutenant Harrow said immediately. "The warp cannot die. It is the reflection of all sentient thought, all emotion, all consciousness in the galaxy. While living beings exist, the Imperium exists. This must be a localized phenomenon. Perhaps a psychic null zone, a dead area in the warp where the currents have temporarily stilled." She glanced at the tactical displays as if they could confirm her hypothesis. "We should attempt to alter course, move toward the system's edge. If this is regional, we can navigate beyond its boundaries and resume normal transit." Chief Engineer Delthor clicked a negative response through his Vox grill, binary cant spilling from his augmented throat in rapid bursts. He switched to Gothic after a moment, his mechanical voice devoid of human inflection. "I have interrogated the ship's cogitators and consulted the machine spirits of every major system. The phenomenon is not localized. I have cross-referenced chronometric data with standard warp transit markers. Based on the Tertius Vigil's last known position and velocity, we should have experienced 17 major warp current fluctuations in the time since Navigator Kaelia recorded our course corrections. We have experienced 0. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally approaches values so small they become meaningless. This is not a dead zone. This is the entire warp falling silent." The strategium went absolutely quiet. I could hear the recycled air moving through the ventilation systems, the distant thrum of the plasma drives, the soft clicking of Delthor's mechadendrites. No one spoke because speaking would make the impossible real. The warp was the fundamental constant of interstellar existence. It was the medium through which humanity projected its will across the void, the terrible necessity that allowed the Imperium to exist as anything more than scattered worlds lost in the dark. Without the warp, there would be no navigators, no astropaths, no faster-than-light travel. Without the warp, humanity would fracture into a billion isolated fragments, each system alone and blind in the vastness of space. The warp could be deadly. It could be cruel. It spawned horrors that defied rational understanding and threatened every human soul with damnation. But it had always been present, always moving, always hungry. A silent warp was like a silent heart. It meant death was coming. Captain Christ broke the silence with a single word: recommendations. It was not a question. It was a demand for solutions from people who had no solutions to give. The chain of command required answers even when answers did not exist. I stood at the edge of the strategium and felt the weight of my own inadequacy like lead in my chest. I was fourth officer on a ship carrying 3,000 souls through hell, and I had nothing to offer except fear and the terrible certainty that we were experiencing something unprecedented in 10,000 years of Imperial history. We maintain course and await further developments, Harrow said finally. Altering navigation without a functioning warp eye is suicide. If this silence persists, we will need to perform a manual translation back to real space, but that requires precise calculations that we cannot make without understanding our current position. I recommend we continue monitoring all systems, maintain battle stations, and prepare for emergency translation protocols. If the warp remains silent for 6 hours, we attempt forced translation and hope we emerge somewhere within the Imperium's borders. Astropath Meridius made a sound like laughter, though nothing about it suggested humor. And if the silence does not end? If the warp has truly died and we drift forever in this calm graveyard? His withered fingers clutched at his robes. There are fates worse than simple death, First Lieutenant. We float above an ocean that has reflected humanity's worst nightmares for 10 millennia. If that ocean has stopped moving, we must ask ourselves what force could impose such stillness. The warp does not simply cease. It is existence itself for the entities that inhabit it. If they have withdrawn, if they have fallen silent, then something has frightened them into hiding. Something has imposed order on chaos itself. I do not think I want to meet the thing capable of that miracle. The Astropath's words hung in the strategium like corpse gas. I thought of Navigator Kaelia smiling as her eye ruptured, of the silence pressing against the hull like an invisible hand, of the wrongness in the air that made every breath feel like breathing liquid nitrogen. I opened my mouth to speak and found I had nothing to say. What could I offer? Platitudes about the Emperor's protection, reassurances drawn from doctrine that had never anticipated this situation. I was a naval officer trained in conventional warfare, in fleet tactics and ship operations. I understood void combat and boarding actions and the proper execution of Imperial law aboard a warship. I did not understand a universe where the warp fell silent. No one did. We were writing the doctrine as we stood there, making decisions that would either save us or doom us with equal probability. Captain Christ straightened slowly, his hands steady again as he regained control of himself. We maintain course. Battle stations. All crew to remain at posts until further notice. I want engineering to begin preliminary calculations for manual translation. If we do not establish communication with other vessels or Imperial authorities within 6 hours, we attempt forced translation, and Emperor help us if we emerge inside a star. He looked at each of us again, his gaze sharp despite the fear I could see swimming beneath the surface. And someone send a work detail to retrieve Navigator Kaelia's body. She deserves proper rights even if we do not survive to perform them. He dismissed us with a gesture and I fled the strategium like a penitent fleeing confession. I returned to my station on the command deck and tried to focus on routine duties. I reviewed crew rosters, checked equipment manifests, cross-referenced, supply requisitions with standing orders. Busy work. Meaningless activity designed to occupy my mind while the universe collapsed around us. The command deck operated with mechanical efficiency. Each crew member focused on their assigned tasks with the desperate intensity of people clinging to normalcy as the only available lifeline. The ship's systems reported perfect function, navigation was stable, weapons were ready, void shields held at full strength. Everything worked exactly as designed except the fundamental nature of reality itself. I caught myself checking the chronometer every few minutes, watching the seconds accumulate like drops of blood from a mortal wound. 1 hour since the silence fell. 2 hours. 3. The warp remained calm as a mill pond, and I began to understand why Navigator Kaelia had smiled. Sometimes the mind breaks when confronted with impossibility. Sometimes it finds beauty in apocalypse. The first Vox transmission reached us 4 hours and 17 minutes into the silence. I was reviewing damage control reports when the communications station exploded with activity, servitors chattering in binary as they struggled to process multiple simultaneous signals. The duty Vox operator, a junior rating named Kellen who could not have been more than 19 standard years old, looked at me with eyes wide as coins. "Sir, we're receiving Imperial channels. Dozens of them. Fleet Command, Astropathic relays, merchant vessels, patrol squadrons. Everyone is broadcasting at once." I moved to the communication station and activated the hololithic display. The strategic overview erupted with markers indicating Imperial vessels across a staggering volume of space. Ships that should have been separated by light years of warp transit appeared on our sensors as if they occupied the same physical location. I realized with a cold shock that we were not alone in the silence. Every vessel in transit through the warp had experienced the same phenomenon, simultaneously. The Sea of Souls had fallen calm across the entire galaxy, and humanity's scattered fleet suddenly found itself trapped in the same impossible moment. The Vox channels were chaos, captains demanding explanations from their navigators, Astropaths screaming that they could feel nothing beyond their own hull plates, Imperial Navy commanders trying to establish order and authority over a fleet that had been scattered seconds ago and was now pressed together like fish in a barrel. I listened to 3 separate vessels report catastrophic navigator deaths, their warp eyes destroyed by something they saw in those final seconds before the silence fell. A merchant hauler broadcasting from somewhere in the segmentum tempestus claimed their astropath had spontaneously combusted, burning from within as if her connection to the warp had reversed polarity and incinerated her soul. Another voice, this one identifying itself as the heavy cruiser Iron Testament, reported that their Geller field had collapsed completely, but no daemons had manifested. They drifted through the warp with nothing but their hull plates separating crew from raw chaos, and nothing happened. The silence held. Captain Christ arrived on the command deck within minutes, First Lieutenant Harrow at his side. He listened to the Vox traffic for exactly 30 seconds before issuing orders. Cut the general channels. Too much noise. Establish secure communication with any Battlefleet Obscurus vessels in range and request status reports. I want to know if this phenomenon is limited to our sector or if it extends across the entire segmentum, and contact the Iron Testament immediately. If their Geller field has collapsed and they're still intact, I want to know what they're seeing outside their hull. The next 2 hours dissolved into a blur of communication and crisis management. We established contact with 7 other Imperial Navy vessels, all reporting the same impossible silence. A Dictator-class cruiser named Emperor's Wrath transmitted astropathic logs indicating that the silence had begun simultaneously across multiple sectors, suggesting a galaxy-wide event rather than localized phenomenon. A squadron of escorts attached to Battlefleet Gothic reported that their navigators had detected something in the final moments before the warp fell calm, a sensation they described as pressure withdrawing, like water receding from a shoreline before a tidal wave. The Iron Testament sent visual recordings of the warp beyond their collapsed Geller field. The images showed nothing. Not the roiling chaos of the Imperium, not the twisted geometries of impossible space. Just darkness. Smooth, perfect, absolute darkness like the void between galaxies. The warp had not died. It had been emptied. 6 hours into the silence, Captain Christ made his decision. We would attempt manual translation back to real space. The risk was catastrophic. Without a navigator to guide the ship through the final moments of transition, we could emerge anywhere, inside a planet's gravity well, in the heart of a star. In the cold void between systems where we would drift until supplies ran out and the crew died of starvation. But remaining in the silent warp felt worse. The calm was unnatural, artificial, imposed by some force we could not comprehend. When that force withdrew or shifted its attention, the warp would return with a vengeance. Better to face certain danger in real space than wait for the ocean to remember how to scream. Chief Engineer Delthor performed the calculations himself, his mechadendrites interfacing directly with the ship's navigation cogitators as he worked through equations that would determine whether we lived or died. The mathematics of warp translation were never exact. Even with a navigator's psychic perception guiding the process, ships sometimes emerged light years from their intended destination. Manual translation was essentially blind firing into the dark and hoping you hit something survivable. Delthor worked for 3 hours while the ship held its breath. When he finally presented his findings to Captain Christ, His mechanical voice carried a hint of something I chose to interpret as uncertainty. I have identified 3 potential translation vectors with acceptable probability distributions. The first offers 67% confidence of emergence within a viable system. The second offers 53% confidence of emergence within the Imperium's borders, but cannot guarantee system viability. The third offers 31% confidence, but would place us closest to our original destination. He paused, servos whirring as he processed implications. All 3 vectors require we trust the silence to hold during translation. If the warp becomes active during the process, the ship will be torn apart before we complete transition. Christ selected the first vector without hesitation. 67% was better odds than most naval engagements offered. He ordered the ship to battle stations and began the translation sequence personally, his command authorizations unlocking the plasma drives and warp engines for the delicate ballet of dimensional transition. I stood at my station and felt my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape my chest. Around me, the command deck crew worked with practiced efficiency, but I could see the fear in their movements, the way their hands shook as they manipulated controls, the way they avoided making eye contact with one another. We all knew we might die in the next few minutes. We all knew that dying might be the best possible outcome. The translation began with a shudder that ran through the ship's superstructure like a living thing. The warp engines cycled up to full power, tearing at the membrane between dimensions with brute force instead of navigator finesse. The Gellerfield generators screamed as they tried to maintain stability during the transition. On the hololithic displays, I watched our position in the warp begin to shift, the impossible topology of the Imperium bending around us as we forced our way toward real space. The process should have taken 30 seconds. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of standing on the command deck while the ship groaned and shook and the lights flickered with power fluctuations. 3 minutes of wondering if we would emerge intact or scattered across 1,000 light-years of space as component atoms. 3 minutes of silence broken only by the mechanical sounds of a ship tearing itself free of one reality and stumbling into another. We emerged into real space with a violence that threw half the command deck crew to the floor. I caught myself on the edge of my station hard enough to crack 2 fingers against the metal housing. Klaxons blared immediately as damage control systems registered hull stress and power fluctuations across 3 decks. The main hololithic projector flickered and died, its machine spirit temporarily overwhelmed by the transition's brutality. For 5 seconds, the command deck existed in chaos. Crew members shouting reports while trying to regain their stations, officers demanding information no one had yet gathered. Then the displays came back online and we saw where we had arrived. The Tertius Vigil had emerged at the edge of a system containing 7 planets and a yellow star remarkably similar to Holy Terra's sun. Our sensors immediately identified 3 orbital structures around the 4th planet, massive installations that matched the design profile of Imperial Navy anchorages. We had translated within 300,000 kilometers of an Imperial military installation. Chief Engineer Delthor's 67% confidence had delivered us to what appeared to be exactly where we needed to be. I felt something in my chest unknot slightly. We had survived. We were home. Whatever nightmare had claimed the warp, we had escaped it and found our way back to civilization. First Lieutenant Harrow was already working to identify our location, cross-referencing stellar positions with navigational databases. We're in the Kavar system, Segmentum Obscurus, approximately 14 light-years from our intended destination. The orbital structures are confirmed as Imperial Navy facilities, designated anchorage Kavar Prime. Current fleet composition includes 3 capital ships, 15 escorts, and multiple support vessels. She looked at Captain Christ with something approaching relief. "We're home, sir. We actually made it home." The captain's expression did not change. He stared at the hololithic display showing the Kavar system's disposition, and I saw his jaw tighten. "Vox, establish communication with Anchorage Kavar Prime immediately. Identify us and request permission to approach. I want to know if they experienced the same phenomenon we did." He turned to face the communications station, and I want it done now. The Vox transmission went out on standard Imperial Navy channels, our identification codes and authorization signals broadcasting toward the massive anchorage orbiting Kavar 4. We waited for the response that should have come in seconds. The anchorage had certainly detected our arrival. Our transition from the warp had generated enough energy discharge to register on sensors halfway across the system. They would be tracking us, weapons locked, waiting for proper identification before deciding whether we were friend or potential threat. Standard procedure, basic naval protocol. But the seconds stretched into a minute and no response came. The anchorage remained silent, its communication arrays dark, despite clear evidence of active power systems. Vox, repeat transmission, Christ ordered. Add emergency authentication codes. I want their attention. The signals went out again. Again, no response. On the tactical display, I watched the anchorage orbit the planet in perfect mechanical precision, its void shields active, its weapon batteries tracking in regular patterns that suggested normal defensive operations. Everything looked correct except the silence. Anchorage Kavar Prime made no attempt to communicate, no demand for additional identification, no acknowledgement of our presence whatsoever. It simply orbited its planet like a vast mechanical ghost, performing its functions with perfect dedication and no human awareness at all. Sir, the sensor officer's voice cut through the tension on the command deck. I'm detecting multiple vessels translating into real space throughout the system. Count is 17 vessels so far, multiple class types, all broadcasting Imperial identification. He looked up from his displays with confusion written across his face. They're all coming in at once. It's like every ship in the warp decided to translate simultaneously. I moved to the tactical station and saw what he meant. The Kavar system's sensor. Readings showed vessel after vessel tearing into real space at various points throughout the system's volume. Destroyers and frigates, bulk haulers and merchant vessels, navy cruisers, and even a massive transport that registered as Adeptus Mechanicus designation. They appeared like someone had opened a floodgate, spilling the warp's trapped contents back into normal space all at once. Within 10 minutes we counted 43 vessels, all Imperial registry, all transmitting identification codes and requesting information from the silent anchorage. It's happening everywhere. First Lieutenant Harrow said quietly. She had pulled up astropathic relay logs, accessing messages that had finally begun flowing again as real space communication resumed. Fleet Command is reporting massive simultaneous translations across every sector. Ships that have been trapped in warp transit for hours suddenly emerging all at once. The Astropaths are calling it the Great Silence. 6 hours and 43 minutes where the entire galaxy's worth of warp traffic went dark and then reappeared in real space without warning. She scrolled through the reports, her augmetic eye whirring. Preliminary estimates suggest thousands of vessels affected, maybe tens of thousands across the entire Imperium. Captain Christ ignored her, his attention locked on the silent anchorage. Ready a shuttle. I'm going over there personally. If they won't communicate via Vox, I'll communicate face to face. Castor, you're with me. Harrow, you have command until I return. If anything threatens this ship, you translate back into the warp immediately and run for the nearest Imperial stronghold. I don't care if you have to blind jump. You keep this ship and its crew alive. Understood? Harrow understood. I understood. We all understood that something was desperately wrong with Anchorage Kavar Prime, and the captain was about to walk into whatever horror waited inside. But he was right. We needed to know. We needed to understand what the silence had done to the Imperium's scattered installations, to the thousands of worlds and stations where personnel had remained in real space while the warp fell calm. We needed to see what 6 hours of absolute warp silence looked like from the other side. The shuttle ride to Anchorage Kavar Prime took 37 minutes. I sat in the passenger compartment with Captain Christ and a security detail of 12 armsmen, while the pilot navigated through the orbital traffic that was rapidly becoming dangerously crowded. More vessels continued to translate into the system every few minutes, captains making the same calculation we had made, choosing the certainty of real space over the uncertainty of the silent warp. The Vox channels filled with confused chatter as ship commanders tried to understand what had happened and why the anchorage refused to respond to hails. I listened to a merchant captain speculate that anchorage Kavar Prime had suffered a catastrophic Vox failure. Another voice, this one belonging to a Navy destroyer captain, suggested that the facility had been abandoned or suffered a critical population loss. No one said what we were all thinking. That the anchorage was full of corpses, and we were flying toward a tomb. We docked at one of the primary umbilicals without incident. The facility's automated systems accepted our authorization codes and extended the docking mechanisms with smooth mechanical precision. The umbilical sealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the shuttle's machine spirit confirmed breathable atmosphere on the far side. Everything worked exactly as designed. Everything except the complete absence of human presence. The docking bay should have been controlled by Port Authority personnel, the docking umbilical monitored by security teams, the entire process supervised by at least a dozen officers and ratings. We cycled the airlock and found nothing but empty corridors and silent machinery. The interior of Anchorage, Kavar Prime, looked like a working facility. The lights were on. The air circulation systems hummed with life. Data terminals glowed with active displays showing station operations, power distribution, defensive readiness. We walked through corridors that should have been crowded with personnel and found them empty as a tomb. The armsmen spread out in defensive formation, their lasguns ready, their eyes scanning every intersection and doorway for threats that did not appear. Captain Christ moved with calm deliberation, his bolt pistol holstered but his hand resting on its grip. I followed at his shoulder and felt my skin crawl with the wrongness of it all. This was not a dead facility. This was an active installation without people. The machine spirits performed their sacred duties with perfect dedication, while the humans who should have commanded them simply did not exist. We found the first body in what appeared to be a central hub control station, a naval officer, captain's rank insignia on his uniform, slumped across a command lectern with a data slate still clutched in his lifeless hand. There were no marks of violence, no signs of struggle or damage. He looked like he had simply stopped living while in the middle of his duties. Captain Christ checked for vital signs with professional efficiency and found none. The body had been dead for at least 5 or 6 hours. Approximately the same time, the warp fell silent. We found them everywhere after that. Ratings at their posts, engine seer maintaining the plasma reactors, administratum clerks frozen over their workstations, security personnel collapsed in the middle of corridors. Hundreds of them. Thousands. The entire population of Anchorage Kavar Prime dead at their posts, killed by something that left no mark and gave no warning. They had died as the warp fell silent, every soul on the station extinguished in the same instant. Their bodies showed no trauma, no signs of disease or poisoning or any conventional cause of death. They had simply stopped living, as if something had reached into their chests and turned off their hearts like switches. "Throne of Terror," Captain Christ whispered. It was the first time I had heard him invoke the Emperor's name with genuine prayer rather than casual blasphemy. We stood in what had been the station's command center, surrounded by dozens of corpses still seated at their stations, and tried to comprehend what we were seeing. The entire station, every soul on board. Simultaneous death at the exact moment the warp went silent. He looked at me and I saw raw horror in his eyes. This is what the silence looks like from real space. This is what happens to people who are not protected by a Geller field when the warp stops screaming. I understood then. The terrible, beautiful understanding that had made Navigator Kalia smile as her eye ruptured. The warp was not separate from real space. It was the reflection of real space, the psychic echo of every living consciousness in the galaxy. Human beings were not disconnected from the sea of souls. They were part of it, generating its currents with their thoughts and emotions, feeding it with their existence. When the warp fell silent, when something imposed perfect calm on that ocean of souls, it had created a feedback loop. The silence had propagated backward through the connection between real space and the Imperium. Every unprotected human being in the galaxy had felt it, a moment of perfect psychic stillness that their mortal bodies could not survive. The Geller fields had saved us. The ships in transit had been shielded from the effect by the same technology that protected them from daemons. But everyone else, Every person on every world and station and installation across the Imperium had experienced 6 hours of absolute warp silence while their souls tried to understand why the universe had stopped screaming. "We need to return to the Tertius Vigil," I said. My voice sounded distant, like someone else was speaking. "We need to warn the fleet. If this is what happened to one station, it happened everywhere, every world, every installation. The entire Imperium just experienced a mass casualty event on a scale that makes the Horus Heresy look like a border skirmish." Christ was already moving toward the exit, his bolt pistol drawn now, his command voice cutting through the horror. "All personnel return to the shuttle immediately. We are leaving this facility and establishing contact with Fleet Command. This information needs to reach Terra as soon as possible. The Imperium needs to know what the silence has cost us. We fled Anchorage Kavar Prime like it was full of plague." The shuttle ride back to the Tertius Vigil took half the time as the inbound journey, our pilot pushing the engines beyond safe limits. I sat in the passenger compartment and tried to process the implications of what we had seen. The Imperium's population measured in the quadrillions, spread across 1 million worlds and countless orbital stations and void installations. If even a fraction of them had died during the silence, the death toll would be measured in numbers that lost all meaning. Billions, trillions. How do you comprehend mass death on that scale? How do you begin to calculate the strategic, logistical, economic impact of losing that many people simultaneously? The Imperium had survived 10,000 years through brutal endurance, through the sheer weight of its population and industrial capacity. It had weathered catastrophe after catastrophe because it was too vast to kill all at once. Until now. Until something had reached across the galaxy and reminded humanity that size meant nothing to forces that operated beyond physical law. The Vox channels were chaos when we returned to the ship, reports flooding in from across the segmentum, captains broadcasting findings identical to ours. Every installation they approached was full of corpses. Every orbital station, every void anchorage, every resupply depot, all dead. Ships that had emerged from the warp found themselves surrounded by graveyard infrastructure, the bones of Imperial logistics laid bare. And beneath those immediate reports, a growing horror as captains began to understand the logical conclusion. If the stations were dead, the planets below them were dead. If the orbital facilities showed complete population loss, the worlds they served had suffered the same fate. The silence had killed not just thousands or millions, but entire populations. Hive cities full of corpses. Forge worlds silent as tombs. Agri worlds, where the crops would rot unharvested because every farmer had died in the fields. The Imperium had survived. The ships in transit, the vessels protected by Geller fields, they had weathered the storm intact. But the Imperium they had served no longer existed. The silence had hollowed it out from within, leaving only the shell. Captain Christ established communication with the ranking Imperial Navy officer in the system within 2 hours of our return. Admiral Corvin, commanding the battlecruiser Divine Mandate, had drawn the same conclusions we had and was attempting to organize the scattered fleet elements into some semblance of operational structure. The Vox conference included 16 ship captains, all reporting the same findings, all asking the same questions. What happened? What could possibly cause a galaxy-wide event of this magnitude? Was it the Emperor's judgment? Was it a chaos attack? Was it something else entirely, some external threat that humanity had never encountered before? No one had answers. We had observations and terror, and the growing certainty that everything had changed. Admiral Corvin, to his credit, did not waste time speculating. He issued orders with mechanical efficiency, establishing patrol routes and surveillance patterns, organizing fleet elements into functional battle groups. Ships with navigators who had survived the transition would begin systematic surveys of nearby systems, assessing damage and searching for survivors. Ships without functional warp eyes would remain in the Kavar system and provide security for what would likely become a major rally point. Everyone would maintain strict communication, discipline, and report immediately if they encountered anything unusual, as if everything about this situation was not already unusual beyond belief. The first sign that something was wrong with the silence came 12 hours after our emergence into real space. One of the patrol vessels, a frigate named Emperor's Lance, reported detecting unusual readings from the Kavar system's second planet. A lifeless rock that had never supported human habitation and had no Imperial installations, it should have been strategically worthless. Instead, the frigate's augurs detected massive energy signatures building beneath the planet's crust, power outputs that suggested industrial scale operations far beyond what any known Imperial technology could generate. Admiral Corvin diverted 3 ships to investigate, including the Tertius Vigil. We made our translation to the second planet with weapons ready and void shields at full power, expecting anything from Xenos activity to hidden Mechanicus installations. What we found defied every expectation. The planet's surface showed recent excavation, massive geometric patterns carved into bedrock with precision that suggested machine work rather than natural processes. The excavations led to underground chambers that extended kilometers beneath the surface, and within those chambers something was building, not human construction, not Orc or Eldar, something else. Structures that hurt to look at directly, their geometry shifting subtly whenever observed, their surfaces reflecting light in ways that suggested dimensions beyond normal 3-dimensional space. The augurs could not maintain stable readings. Every scan produced different results, as if the structures refused to exist consistently within our frame of reference. Captain Christ ordered long-range observation only, weapons locked on target, but no approach until we understood what we faced. The structures grew as we watched. Not quickly, but with inexorable certainty, rising from the planetary crust like teeth emerging from infected gums. The frigate, Emperor's Lance, transmitted detailed augur readings that made no sense, energy signatures that matched nothing in Imperial databases, material compositions that oscillated between solid matter and something the sensors interpreted as crystallized time. Chief Engincia Delthor attempted analysis, and his mechadendrites seized mid-calculation, locked in place by some feedback loop his augmented mind could not process. He required 30 minutes of manual recalibration before he could speak again, and when he did, his voice carried a quality I had never heard from a servant of the machine god: fear. "Those structures are not being built," he said quietly. "They are being remembered. The matter that forms them existed in some other state and is now returning to a previous configuration. The energy signatures match no known power source because they are not power sources. They are anchors. Something is reaching through from elsewhere, and these structures mark the locations where that reaching has succeeded." His mechanical eye focused on Captain Christ with unnerving precision. The warp fell silent because something pushed it aside. These structures are what it left behind when it moved. Admiral Corvin ordered immediate withdrawal from the second planet. Whatever was building there, we lacked the resources or understanding to interfere with it. The fleet would establish a defensive perimeter around Kavar 4 and maintain surveillance while sending messages toward any Imperial authorities who might still exist. We needed orders from someone who understood what we faced. We needed the Adeptus Terra, the High Lords, the Emperor himself if such a thing were possible. Instead, we received a transmission from something that claimed to be all of those things and none of them. The message arrived through conventional Vox channels, not astropathic relay. A human voice, speaking perfect High Gothic with an accent that belonged to no region of the Imperium I recognized. It addressed Admiral Corvin directly, using his full name and rank designation, demonstrating knowledge it should not possess. The voice said it represented a coalition of interests that had been observing humanity for a very long time, entities that existed beyond the conventional understanding of space and time. It said the warp had been silenced temporarily as part of a necessary intervention, an action taken to prevent an imminent catastrophe that would have destroyed not just humanity, but every sentient species in the galaxy. The structures on Kavar 2 were stabilizers, anchoring points to maintain the barrier between real space and the immaterium, while repairs were made to fundamental elements of reality itself. The voice said the silence would end soon. The warp would return, hungrier than ever, swollen with 6 hours of accumulated emotion and psychic pressure that had nowhere to go. When it returned, it would surge like a tidal wave breaking against a coastline. Ships would be torn apart, Geller fields would fail. The Astronomican itself would flicker and die for precious seconds as it struggled to reassert control over the suddenly violent sea of souls. Millions more would die in the chaos of that return. But the alternative had been worse. Without intervention, without that brief silence, something called the confluence had been preparing to tear through the barrier between dimensions and render the distinction between warp and real space meaningless. Humanity's galaxy would have become what the Eye of Terror was, a place where physics held no meaning and daemons walked freely among mortal men. The voice said it had saved us. It said we should be grateful. It said the structures would remain as permanent monuments to this moment, reminders that humanity did not walk the galaxy alone and that forces beyond its comprehension had taken interest in its survival. Then the transmission ended and we sat in silence more profound than anything the warp could produce. Admiral Corvin broke protocol and asked for opinions. What he received was argument, anger, fear expressed as aggression. Half the assembled captains insisted the transmission was a chaos trick, daemons sowing confusion now that their initial assault had failed. A quarter believed it was Xenos manipulation, Eldar or something worse playing games with human perception. The remainder admitted they had no explanation and wanted orders that made sense of the inexplicable. I sat in the Tertius Vigil strategium and listened to professional naval officers tear at each other like feral dogs, because their understanding of reality had shattered and no one could put it back together. The warp returned exactly as the voice had predicted. 22 hours and 14 minutes after the silence fell, the Sea of Souls remembered how to scream. Every ship in the Kavar system felt it simultaneously, a psychic shockwave that sent Astropaths into seizures and made unaugmented crew members stumble as if struck by physical force. The warp did not gradually resume its normal patterns. It exploded back into existence with accumulated fury. 6 hours of suppressed emotion and psychic energy released all at once like a dam breaking. Ships that had been preparing to translate into warp space for systematic surveys found their navigators bleeding from every orifice as the warp eye struggled to process the sudden surge. 3 vessels lost Geller field cohesion during emergency translations and vanished into the Imperium with all hands. Another 4 suffered catastrophic failures of warping engines that could not handle the stress of the returning chaos. We lost 7 ships in 40 seconds and counted ourselves fortunate the number was not higher. The Astronomican flickered. Every Astropath in the fleet felt it. The guiding light of the Emperor's will dimming for 3 eternal seconds as the psychic choir struggled to maintain their sacred task against the returning storm. When it stabilized, the relief was palpable. If the Astronomican had failed permanently, humanity would have been blind in the void, unable to navigate the warp beyond short jumps based on dead reckoning. That it held, that it weathered the shock and resumed its function, suggested that Terra itself had survived. The Golden Throne endured. The Emperor protected even now. But the galaxy the Astronomican illuminated had changed. The first survey reports came in within hours of the warp's return. Ships with functional navigators began systematic jumps to nearby systems, assessing the damage, searching for survivors, trying to understand the scope of what the silence had cost humanity. They found death. Hive world Calpis 7, home to 17 billion souls, silent. Forge world Metallus Gamma, primary weapons manufacturer for the Segmentum, dark. Agricultural systems that fed entire sectors, abandoned. Naval stations, empty. Only the ships had survived. Only those protected by Geller fields or blessed by chance to be in transit when the silence fell. The Imperium's population had been reduced by estimates that varied wildly but never fell below 60% losses. Some sectors reported 90% casualty rates. Entire subsectors had been depopulated in 6 hours of absolute stillness. The strategic implications defied calculation. The Imperium's war machine had ground to a halt because there was no one left to operate it. Forge worlds that produced ammunition sat silent because every tech priest had died at their stations. Agri worlds, where crops rotted in the fields, because no one remained to harvest them. Guard regiments scattered across 1,000 battlefields suddenly cut off from resupply and reinforcement because the logistics network had collapsed. The administratum, that vast bureaucratic machine that kept the Imperium functioning, had been decapitated. Records were lost. Tithes would go uncollected. Entire worlds would slip through the cracks as there was simply no one left alive who remembered they existed. And the Xenos would know. The Orcs would sense weakness and surge from their kingdoms in unprecedented numbers. The Tyranids would detect the sudden absence of psychic presence across vast swaths of space and redirect their hive fleets toward the newly vulnerable territory. The Tau would expand into systems that no longer had the population to resist them. Chaos itself, swollen with the feast of fear and death that the silence had provided, would pour from the Eye of Terror with renewed vigor. Humanity had survived the silence. Now, it would face everything that survival had cost. Captain Christ called the senior staff together 7 days after our arrival in the Kavar system. We had received fragmentary reports from across the segmentum, piecing together a picture of the new reality we inhabited. Admiral Corvin had established himself as de facto sector authority, organizing the scattered fleet elements into a functional command structure, despite having no legitimate claim to such power beyond being the ranking officer present. No one challenged him because the alternative was chaos. Someone needed to make decisions, and he was willing to bear that burden. "We have orders," Christ said without preamble. "The Admiral is organizing relief convoys to systems that might still have survivor populations. Agricultural worlds where some portion of the population might have been underground or otherwise shielded. Orbital installations where compartmentalization might have saved some crew. We're to survey 17 systems in the trailing Corward quadrant and render assistance where possible." He paused and looked at each of us. "We are also to investigate any unusual phenomena. The structures on Kavar 2 have begun emitting some kind of signal, not vox, not psychic, something else that our instruments can barely detect. The Admiral wants to know if similar structures have appeared elsewhere." First Lieutenant Harrow spoke carefully. "Sir, with respect, we're a warship. We carry minimal supplies for relief operations. We have no Medicaid facilities adequate for mass casualty situations. We have no personnel trained in survivor extraction or humanitarian operations. We're designed to fight, not provide aid." "I am aware of our limitations," Christ said coldly. "I am also aware that every vessel in this fleet is operating beyond its designed parameters because the infrastructure that supported us no longer exists. We will render what aid we can and complete our survey mission. The Imperium has not fallen. It has been wounded, perhaps mortally, but it endures. We endure. And we will do our duty until someone with legitimate authority tells us to stand down." He straightened, and I saw the weight of command settle across his shoulders like a physical burden. "Prepare the ship for immediate translation. We depart in 6 hours." The first system we surveyed was Hebron's world, a minor agri-planet that supplied grain to 3 nearby hive worlds. We found the orbital station empty as expected, the population dead at their posts. But the planet below showed signs of life. Thermal signatures consistent with active settlements, Vox signals broadcasting on Imperial frequencies. We sent a shuttle down and found approximately 40,000 survivors, farmers who had been working deep underground in geothermal greenhouses when the silence fell. They had emerged to find every surface settlement empty, every neighbor dead, the entire planet transformed into a tomb with them as the only living inhabitants. They had survived 6 hours of warp silence because they happened to be far enough below ground that the psychic shockwave had been attenuated. Random chance had saved them while billions died. They asked us what had happened. We told them the truth because lying would have been crueler. Then we left them with what supplies we could spare and moved on because 40,000 people could not repopulate a planet, and we lacked the resources to evacuate them. The second system contained no survivors but did have one of the structures. We detected it on the system's 4th planet, a gas giant with no solid surface. The structure existed in the upper atmosphere, floating impossibly without any visible means of support, its geometry shifting like the one we had observed on Kavar 2. Chief Engincia Delthor attempted close-range scanning, and his equipment suffered catastrophic failures. The machine spirits recoiled from the structure as if it were anathema, refusing to process data that violated their fundamental understanding of reality. We marked the location in our navigation logs and departed without further investigation. Some things were beyond our capacity to comprehend, and we had neither the time nor resources to waste on mysteries. By the 10th system, we had developed a grim routine: translation, system scan, assessment of casualties, minimal interaction with any survivor populations, documentation of unusual phenomena, translation to the next location. We found survivors in 3 of the 17 systems we surveyed. 3. The other 14 were empty graves, entire populations extinguished in a moment of silence. We stopped asking why. We stopped trying to understand the mechanisms that had killed so many while sparing so few. We simply recorded the data and moved on because that was what soldiers did when confronted with horror beyond processing. The reports from other survey vessels painted similar pictures across the entire price. Segmentum, casualty rates varied by system, but the pattern remained consistent. Anyone unprotected by Geller fields or deep underground had died. Anyone in transit through the warp had survived. The Imperium's population had been cut by more than half in 6 hours, and the survivors faced a future more bleak than anything in 10,000 years of Imperial history. The infrastructure was gone. The manufacturing capacity was gone. The agricultural production was gone. What remained was a scattered fleet of ships, a handful of survivor populations, and the terrible knowledge that something had reached across the galaxy and reminded humanity of its fragility. The first rebellion started 37 days after the silence. A group of merchant captains in the Segmentum Pacificus refused to acknowledge imperial authority, declaring themselves an independent coalition operating outside the Emperor's law. They argued that the Imperium had died with the silence, that the structures that remained were corpse institutions, acting out the forms of life without substance. They proposed new governance, new systems of trade and mutual protection divorced from the crushing weight of the administratum and the ecclesiarchy. Admiral Corvin ordered their suppression with extreme prejudice. 5 merchant vessels were destroyed before the remainder surrendered. He had them executed immediately and broadcast recordings of the executions across every Vox channel under his control. The Imperium endured. Rebellion would be met with death. There would be no negotiations, no compromises, no tolerance for those who would use catastrophe as excuse for treason. But the rebellion was just the first. Others followed. Guard regiments cut off from the command structure declared independence and established local warlord states. Worlds with survivor populations refused to acknowledge authority from distant terror. Rogue trader dynasties began carving out private empires in regions where no Imperial Navy remained to challenge them. The Imperium fractured, not completely. The core institutions around Terra and the major sector capitals maintained cohesion, but the edges frayed, entire regions slipping away into anarchy or petty dictatorships because no one had the resources to enforce compliance. And the Xenos came. The Orcs launched the largest war in recorded history, sensing weakness and surging from every corner of the galaxy toward Imperial space. The Tyrannid Hive fleets altered course mid-approach, redirecting toward regions that had been depopulated by the silence. The Tau began aggressive expansion campaigns, conquering worlds that could not defend themselves and offering protection to human populations who had been abandoned by the Imperium. Chaos warbands poured from the Eye of Terror in numbers that suggested every daemon had been summoned simultaneously. The galaxy burned and humanity lacked the strength to fight. The Tertius Vigil spent 6 months on patrol duties in the Segmentum Obscurus, part of a fleet squadron that attempted to maintain order in a region sliding toward chaos. We fought Orc raiders, suppressed human rebellions, escorted supply convoys between scattered survivor populations. We did everything we could with resources that diminished every day because there was no resupply, no reinforcement, no support structure beyond what individual captains could improvise. Captain Christ aged 10 years in those 6 months. I watched the weight of impossible decisions grind him down, watched him order actions that would have been unthinkable before the silence. We fired on human vessels because they refused to submit to imperial law. We abandoned survivor populations because evacuating them would have left us unable to continue our mission. We made choices that saved thousands by sacrificing hundreds, and called it victory because the alternative was losing everything. The structures remained. They appeared across the galaxy, always in locations that seemed strategically meaningless. Dead planets, empty systems, regions of space that held no resources or tactical value. But their presence was consistent, their geometry unchanging despite the chaos surrounding them. Some called them monuments, others called them warnings. The ecclesiarchy declared them sacred, manifestations of the emperor's will made physical. The Mechanicus studied them obsessively, attempting to decode their purpose and function. The Inquisition investigated them with characteristic paranoia, searching for signs of Xenos manipulation or demonic taint. No one found answers. The structures existed, solid and incomprehensible, reminders that something had intervened in humanity's affairs, and that intervention had cost more than anyone could calculate. We received orders to return to the Kavar system 9 months after the silence. Admiral Corvin had established it as a major rally point and logistics hub, one of the few locations in the segmentum with enough intact infrastructure to support fleet operations. We made the translation expecting to find an organized military installation. Instead, we found civil war. 2 factions within the fleet had come to violence over questions of authority and resource distribution. Admiral Corvin was dead, killed in the opening moments of the conflict by officers who believed his leadership had failed. The station orbiting Kavar 4 had been damaged in the fighting, its population reduced again by fratricidal combat. We arrived to find what remained of the Imperial Navy in the sector tearing itself apart because no one could agree on what came next. Captain Christ refused to take sides. He established communication with both factions and declared the Tertius Vigil neutral ground. He offered his ship as a meeting place for negotiations, his crew as honest brokers between parties that had lost all trust. It was foolish. It was naive. It was exactly what a man of principle would do when confronted with senseless violence. The negotiations failed within 3 hours. Both factions accused Christ of favoring the other. Both demanded he commit the Tertius Vigil to their cause. When he refused, they declared him traitor and opened fire. We barely escaped the Kavar system intact, translation into warp space, completed under fire from vessels that should have been our allies. That was when I understood the truth the voice in the transmission had tried to tell us. The silence had not killed the Imperium. It had revealed what the Imperium had always been beneath its facade of unity and purpose. A collection of barely controlled factions held together by force and the threat of external enemies. Remove the infrastructure that maintained that control, and humanity reverted to what it had been before the Emperor's unification. Tribal, violent, consumed by petty conflicts while the galaxy burned around it. The silence had saved humanity from some external threat called the confluence. In doing so, it had destroyed the structures that kept humanity from destroying itself. We wandered for another 3 months, jumping from system to system, searching for somewhere that resembled order. We found nothing. Every installation we approached was either dead or dying, consumed by internal conflict or Xenos assault. The Imperium existed in name only, a memory that ships carried with them as they fled through the void. Captain Christ stopped trying to maintain discipline after the second mutiny attempt. Too many crew members had lost faith in everything they had served. They wanted to find a safe world and settle, abandon the ship and try to build something new from the ashes. Christ had them executed and their bodies spaced. He gave a speech afterward about duty and sacrifice that no one believed. We stayed at our posts because leaving meant death, not because we believed in the cause anymore. The Tertius Vigil died in the Vandus system, defending an agri-world, with 200,000 survivors from an orc raiding fleet. We were outgunned, outmaneuvered, operating with systems failing from months of combat without proper maintenance. We knew we would lose. Captain Christ ordered the engagement anyway, because the alternative was abandoning Imperial citizens to Xenos slaughter. We lasted 47 minutes. The orc cruisers tore through our void shields like they were paper. Hull breaches across 17 decks, plasma drive containment failing. half the crew dead in the opening salvos. Christ ordered evacuation and went down with his ship like captains in old stories. I escaped in a life pod with 37 other survivors and watched the Tertius Vigil break apart from a distance that was both too far and not nearly far enough. The orcs ignored the life pods. They were too busy landing troops on the agri-world below, claiming their prize. I spent 3 days in that pod with 37 other people, breathing recycled air and watching the supplies dwindle, before a merchant vessel answered our distress beacon. They demanded payment for rescue. We had nothing to offer except our service. Most of us agreed. 5 people chose to remain in the pod, preferring death to indentured servitude. I never learned if they survived. I serve aboard the merchant vessel Prophet's Edge now. We run trade routes through sectors that used to be civilized space and are now contested territory. We deal with imperial remnants, independent colonies, rogue trader dynasties, and anyone else with goods to exchange. The captain is former Navy, like many of us. He understands that the Imperium is dead, and something else is being born in its place. Something smaller, something meaner. Something that might survive the predation of the galaxy if we are clever and ruthless enough. The structures remain visible throughout our travels. We pass them on our routes, floating in the void or standing on dead worlds, their impossible geometry unchanging. The crew avoids looking at them directly. Some pray when we pass, others curse. I just record them in the navigation logs, marking their positions for future reference. They are monuments to the day the galaxy held its breath. Reminders that humanity is not alone in the void, and that the forces which shape our existence operate according to rules we do not understand. Sometimes I dream about the silence. About those 6 hours when the warp fell calm and Navigator Kaelia died smiling. In my dreams, I stand on the bridge of the Tertius Vigil and watch reality come undone, threads of causation unraveling like rotten cloth. In my dreams, I hear the voice from the transmission speaking directly to me, explaining in perfect detail what the confluence was and why preventing its emergence required the death of trillions. In my dreams, I understand, and the understanding is worse than ignorance. I wake in my bunk aboard the Prophet's Edge and thank the Emperor. I cannot remember what my sleeping mind comprehended. The galaxy moves on. The Imperium fractures further every day. The Xenos press their advantages while humanity tears itself apart over questions of succession and authority. Reports filter through the scattered Vox networks of terror under siege, of the High Lords dead, of civil war consuming the throne world itself. I do not know if any of it is true. Truth has become a commodity more valuable than ammunition. Everyone claims to speak with imperial authority. Everyone insists their faction represents the Emperor's will. It means nothing. The silence killed the truth along with everything else. But humanity endures. In scattered colonies and wandering fleets, in fortified strongholds and hidden settlements, people survive. They adapt. They find new ways to exist in a galaxy that has become more hostile than it was before. They tell stories about the time before the silence, mythologizing the Imperium into something it never was. A golden age of unity and purpose. A time when the Emperor's light reached every corner of human space and brought order to chaos. They forget that the Imperium was already dying before the silence. They forget the corruption, the waste, the grinding machinery of bureaucracy that consumed entire generations. They remember only that it existed, and they did not have to think about what came next. I write this account 23 months after the silence fell. I do not know who will read it. I do not know if it will survive beyond my death. But someone needs to record what happened, to document the moment when everything changed. The Imperium fell in 6 hours of perfect calm, not with battle or fire or dramatic last stands. It fell in silence, souls extinguished like candles in vacuum, leaving only the structures we built and the ships we sailed, and the terrible knowledge that something had decided our survival was worth the cost. The warp has returned to its usual chaos. The daemons are back, perhaps hungrier than before. The storms rage with renewed violence. Navigators chart courses through the sea of souls, and sometimes they succeed, and sometimes the Imperium devours entire vessels. Nothing has changed and everything has changed. We still sail the void. We still fight for survival. We still invoke the Emperor's name when we pray for deliverance. But we know now what we did not know before, that the universe contains forces beyond our understanding, that something watches us from beyond the veil of reality, that our survival depends on powers we cannot control or predict or even properly comprehend. The structures stand as testament to this truth, monuments to intervention, warnings against complacency, reminders that humanity does not walk the galaxy alone, and that the things which share this space with us operate according to priorities that have nothing to do with our comfort or survival. We were saved. We were damned. Both things are true simultaneously, and the contradiction does not resolve. I served the Imperium. I believed in the Emperor's vision of unified humanity spreading across the stars. I thought our purpose was clear and our enemies were known. The silence taught me that I understood nothing. The galaxy is larger than human comprehension. The forces that shape existence operate on scales that make our wars and empires and grand schemes into brief flickers of meaningless light. We matter and we do not matter. We are saved and we are doomed. The warp screams again and we pretend that normal has returned when normal died in 6 hours of perfect calm. This is my testimony. This is my warning. The day the screaming stopped was the day humanity learned it was never in control. Whatever comes next, whatever rises from the ashes of the Imperium, it will exist at the sufferance of things we cannot name. The structures watch. The void remembers. And somewhere beyond the threshold of human perception, something that called itself our savior waits to collect payment for a service we never requested and cannot afford to repay. The galaxy holds its breath again now, but this time we know the silence will not last. This time we understand that calm is not peace, just the moment before everything burns. Navigator Kaelia died smiling because she understood this truth in her final moments. She saw beyond the veil and comprehended what was coming. I wish I had her courage. I wish I could smile at apocalypse the way she did. Instead, I write these words and hope that someone, somewhere, will read them and understand. The Imperium is dead. Humanity endures. And the structures that mark the boundary between these two truths stand eternal, monuments to the day we learned that survival is not victory, just the cruelest possible defeat.